Alright, today I am mixing up my white leaven bread recipe that I got from Kathleen Bushy. And I'm starting out with my sourdough starter. And I have a lidded container here that I'm going to put my starter build into. And I'm using a scale to measure all of my ingredients. So I'm going to start by zeroing out the scale, turning it on. So it's at 0, and now I'm going to add my starter. So this is what my starter looks like right now. I fed it earlier this week, and then put it back in the refrigerator. So it is kind of liquidy, and I'm going to be putting, let's see, 389 grams of starter into the bowl. So now I'm going to zero out my scale again, and I'm going to add, so now it's at 0, and so now I'm going to add 215 grams of flour, and I'm using bread flour, and this is from Dakota Made. I'm adding that just right into the bowl. If I add a little too much, I can just scoop it back out. So now I'm going to zero out my scale again, and this time I have a measuring cup because it's a lot more difficult to take back the water after you've added it. I'm adding 215 grams of filtered water, which equals about 1 2/3 cups. So now I am just adding in the water to the rest of my mixture with the starter and the flour, and mixing it up. I'm using a Danish dough whisk, but you can just use a spoon. I like it because it works with the wet dough really well. And once this is all mixed up, I'm going to cover it and put it in a warm place to sit for the next 6 to 8 hours. And that's my starter build. And this is how the starter build looks when it's ready for its rest. This is the recipe for mixing your final dough. You could add less flour if you want a wetter dough, but I'd recommend starting with the original amount. After we mix the dough, we'll be stretching and folding for the next 5 to 6 hours, so plan to be home for that amount of time. So my starter build is nice and bubbly now. It's been sitting for 6 hours in a nice warm spot. I like to use the top of my refrigerator. And now I'm going to measure out 530 grams of starter build. So I'm zeroing out my scale and putting in 530 grams. Be sure to measure it here. Don't just start adding flour because there's way too much in here. I have about 1 cup of starter remaining in here of my starter build, and I can put that back in with my other starter, or I can use it for another recipe. This is really just a fed starter. So now it's time to mix the dough, and I am again adding bread flour. That's Dakota Made bread flour. I'm zeroing out my scale, and I am adding 1,250 grams of flour, which is about 7 1/3 cups. Now I'm adding and weighing all this in this smaller bowl, but that's just because my large mixing bowl is too heavy to put on this scale. Now again, I am weighing out my water in a separate container because if I overfill it, then I can easily get the water back. So I'm zeroing it out, and for water I'm adding 712 grams, which is about 3 1/3 cups. So now I'm just going to dump everything into my giant, lovely ceramic mixing bowl. I just got this bowl from my mother-in-law, and I absolutely love this bowl because when I mix up my sticky dough, it doesn't stick to the bottom and bring the bowl up with it and then send the bowl crashing back down to the counter. You'll see what I mean if you're using a lighter bowl. It's not a big deal if it's plastic, but if it's glass or ceramic, you want to be careful. So I'm just dumping the water, the starter, the flour all in there. And with my Danish dough whisk, I'm mixing it all into a dough. At this point, you might need to use your hands, so make sure they're clean, you've got all your rings off. And just try to incorporate as much of the flour as you can, but you really don't want to overwork the dough. We're not kneading, really, we're just kind of trying to get all that dough mixed in, all the flour mixed into the dough, I mean. And you'll end up with what's really a shaggy mess. It breaks easily, there's really no gluten development, and this is exactly what you want. It's soft, and it's ready to rest. This is called the Oddilees. I'm going to cover it with plastic and let it rest for 15 minutes. So while my dough is resting, I like to measure out the salt, and this is 3 teaspoons of sea salt, and I set it up on top of the plastic wrap on top of my bowl so that I don't forget to add it in the next step, because this is a really easy step to forget. So now it's time to add the salt, and you can just go ahead and dump it in. And I'm going to pick up the dough, fold the salt in a bit, and then I'm going to do something called a stretch and fold. And this is where I'm holding the dough and I'm just stretching the sides and pulling the dough underneath. And I'm going to do this a little bit longer than I normally will for the rest of the stretch and folds, for this first step, to just try to incorporate that salt a little bit. It won't be fully incorporated right now, but we're going to stretch and fold many more times, and it'll be totally incorporated by the end. So the dough is a little bit more smooth, and now it's ready to rest for another 15 minutes covered by plastic. It's time to do our next stretch and fold. So I'm picking up the dough, which is, you can see, is sticky and has a lot more gluten development now. And I'm just going to turn it under a few times as I rotate it in my hands. And you're not going to do this for any longer than 10 or 15 seconds. And I'm going to set it back down in the bowl, cover it up, let it sit for another 15 minutes. Alright, we're going to stretch and fold one more time. I'm just pulling the sides under and pulling it around just a couple times. You can see the dough is a lot more smooth now. I'm going to put it back to rest, this time for 30 minutes, and I'm actually going to do this process 3 more times. And these 3 steps are called the bulk ferment. I'm not going to show them to you because it's the same thing over and over again. You're going to stretch and fold, rest for 60 minutes, stretch and fold, rest another 60 minutes, and finally stretch and fold and rest for 2 hours before you start to shape. So it has been 4 hours, and I've done 3 stretch and folds and rests in between. And now you can see that the dough is risen quite a bit, and when I press my finger into it, it keeps the indent, so that means that it's ready for the next step. So I'm going to gently lift it out on the oiled countertop. You could also use a silicone mat. And I'm going to be dividing this into 4 loaves. Normally you divide it into 3. I'm going to do 2 large loaves and then 2 smaller ones. And you could usually weigh it out, but I'm just going to do it by sight today. And I am cutting it just with my bench scraper, but you could use a knife as well. Shape it really gently without letting all those nice air bubbles get squished. And just really quickly turning it under. And I'm going to let it sit for another 15 minutes before I do the final shape. So while the dough is resting, right before I proof it, I'm going to get the containers ready. And I have, for my large loaves, I have 2 bannetons, and these are cane baskets that I have sprinkled with rice flour inside. and the rice flour helps to make sure that the dough releases when I put it out onto the pizza peel. And then because I only have 2 bannetons, and if you don't have bannetons, you can just use a bowl or a colander like this one, and I'm just lining it with a towel that I will also sprinkle heavily with rice flour. And then finally I have a loaf pan that I'm going to butter for a sandwich loaf, and I found that butter works better than oil. Oil, the bread seems to stick a little bit more. The dough has rested for its last 15 minutes, and now it's time to shape it. So I'm going to gently pick up the loaf, and I'm going to kind of tuck my hands underneath it and just slide it along the bench, pulling it towards me and tucking the ends under, just making it smooth on top. If there's any big bubbles that pop up on top, I can pop those, but I generally want to keep as much air in there as possible. And when it's looking nice and rounded like I want it, I'll pick it up and put it upside down into the banneton. So the seam side is up, because I'm going to flip it over tomorrow when I bake it. And I'll do the same thing for the bread loaf, but I want to have it be more of an oblong shape. So when I rested it, I kind of made it more oblong. I'm going to pinch away that bubble there. This one I'm going to put right side up into the pan because this is what I'm going to be cooking it in. I won't be flipping it upside down. Pinch away those big bubbles. Now I'm going to cover both of these, and I like to use plastic shower caps because they fit right over, and you can use them over and over again. You can also use these as your cover for your bowl when you're doing your stretch and folds and your rests. Now these are going to go into a cool place, about 50 degrees, or a refrigerator, for the next 6 to 18 hours for their final proof. This is what the dough looks like after it's been proofing for about 13 hours, and you can see it's risen quite a bit, and when I press my finger into it, the indent stays and doesn't grow back. So that means it's well proofed. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually leave it out covered at room temperature for the next hour or so while I warm up the oven. Getting my oven up to 400. I'm actually doing mine a little higher because it doesn't hold the temperature very well. And I've got my bread sitting on top so that it can take advantage of the heat. And this is how I have it set up. There is a baking stone in the middle, and there's a baking stone above that one on the top rack, making a little mini oven. If you only have one baking stone, you can just do what I'm doing here on the top and have it closer to the top, and that way the top of the oven makes your little mini oven. With the way I have it set up now, I can do multiple loaves at once. Now I also have a pan with rocks in the bottom that's also heating up, and I'm going to pour boiling water in that to create steam later. If you don't have a pan or rocks that can withstand boiling water, like these are sauna rocks, you can just use a broiler pan. It is time to bake our bread, and I have a pizza peel set up here with cornmeal on top. You could also use semolina flour or parchment paper, and if you don't have a pizza peel, you could use a cutting board or you could flip a cookie sheet upside down. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my bowl and carefully set the bread down onto the cornmeal, and quickly I'm going to score the top. And I don't have a lamb, one of those fancy bread blades, so I just use a bread knife, and it is at a 45-degree angle. And I'm just making a cross on top to give that a way to rise. Now I'm going to, without waiting too long, get this bread into the oven and slide it right back in onto the baking stone. I'm sliding it to the back because I'm going to add more loaves. For this one, I'm cutting it with kind of a wheat design. You just want to cut nice and strong. I'm putting my last loaf, my bread pan loaf in. You can see I have all of my loaves in the oven. And now I'm going to add about a cup of boiling water to the pan at the bottom to create steam. And I'm going to check these loaves in about 20 minutes. 20 minutes has passed and my loaves are looking gorgeous. I still need more time, but I am going to pop this bread loaf out of the loaf pan, and it's getting a little brown on top, so I'm just going to set it down here, and popping it out of the loaf pan helps it to brown evenly all the way around. The bread's been in the oven for about 15 more minutes, and it is ready to take out. You can tell that it's ready because it has this nice deep brown on the top. It also will sound hollow when you tap it. And you could also take the temperature of the bread, and it should be at about 200 degrees. If you're really quiet, you can hear the bread crackling. These are our final loaves of bread. You want to let them cool on a wire rack for at least an hour before you cut into them. It's time to cut into our very first loaf. And I'm just going to cut this right down the middle so we can see what it looks like on the inside. And you can see it has had a nice rise. It has a nice looking crumb. It's all the way done in the middle. And if you want to have more holes in your bread, you'd want to have a wetter dough. But this is just how I like it, and it's easy for me to make, and I hope it works for you too.